through Super Sandy, and 30 times more depression. So we're looking at long-term mental health, stress, trauma impact on children and young people. These are not short-term acute impacts. In Mexico, they've measured the impact of air pollution, and we are going in that direction here in the UK with air pollution, particularly in cities. They found physical hallmarks of Alzheimer's in 11-month-old children, and air pollution in Mexico is affecting 99% of the population. I did a recent piece of research, not published yet, but it will be soon. So this is on top of what we're going to look at here, of young children, because we're often talking to teenagers, young adults, 6 to 12-year-olds. We asked 700 6 to 12-year-olds, this is a YouGov poll, how they felt, how worried they were about climate change. We also asked them about cost of living and the war in Ukraine as well. And 80% of 6 to 12-year-olds told us they were frightened of climate change. So these young people, these children are growing up fully aware of the world in which they're growing, which is different to the world in which anyone over the age of 25 or 30 grew up in. And there's two things, I promise I'm not reading off slides, I promise, but I put them here so they're available. There's two things to pick out of this. One is the direct impact. Yes, obviously, we can totally understand dealing with fires, wildfires, or, flooding or smoke from wildfires. We can understand immediately this has a traumatic impact, of course, easy to understand. But what we're seeing is psychologically the stressor, the long-term and distant impact, hearing stories about other people running from fires, reading about it in the news, seeing it, hearing about survivors. It has just as bad an impact. The IPCC reports now on climate change are recognizing, in terms of mental health, this range of things. Climate anxiety, we've missed the boat on calling it anything better than eco-anxiety, and it's being claimed by young people, and honestly, anything that gets people talking about mental health is fine with me. Technically, I think I can get away with saying this here. Instead of eco-anxiety, it should be called politician anxiety, because what we fear and what we're anxious about is the failure of leadership around these things. We've got anxiety, vicarious trauma, direct trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complicated grief. And the reason it's complicated grief is because we're causing it. It's not straightforward. So it's very similar to the griefs that we were feeling and experiencing and are still experiencing through COVID, because there's a human-caused element to it. UNICEF, understandably, expectedly, are all over this, looking at the Children's Climate Risk Index, because, again, it's this stress vulnerability model. I always feel really guilty. I'm so sorry, you guys, saying this in front of you, like you're not sat there listening to me saying you're going to have mental health difficulties for the rest of your life. So I'm really sorry. But you know this, don't you? You know I'm with you on this. It's so difficult. But we're talking about chronic, long-term stress emerging from childhood trauma, this exposure to childhood trauma. There's a few other children's voices that I want to flag out. This was a young woman who absolutely stopped me in my tracks last year. She said to me, "I wish I was mad." And I said, "Do you know what you're wishing for? It's not a nice thing to wish for." She said, "Yeah." She said, "I wish I was." She said, "Because dealing with being mad would be easier than dealing with anxiety about climate change that I face every day." More quotes from children. These are in the UK. "Tell me how I should live in a world that doesn't care. I'm working with children and young people in clinical practice who are suicidal. And it's not that they want to die. They just don't know how to live, surrounded by a global culture of uncare." A child in the Maldives said to me, "My friends are dying. My friends, the fish, are dying." It's not eco-anxiety, it's eco-terror. And climate change is like Thanos. They had to explain the cultural reference to me, embarrassingly, in the Avengers Endgame, whose ideology is to kill off half of life in the universe so the other half can thrive. They said, "But we're the half being killed off." So children, young people, young generations are embodying and holding this awareness without political power, without economic power. It's not that they don't have agency, as we're going to hear in a minute. I'm going to stop talking very soon, and we can hear from these two. But they have agency, but they also need us to elevate their voices and to understand how this impacts on children and young people physically, emotionally, cognitively, differently. And it's not just anxiety about climate change or biodiversity crisis. It's the lack of action from adults. It's a relational trauma. Because of my social work background, when I started doing these interviews, I started thinking, but this is how I have interviewed and listened to children coming into foster care for years. The very people who are supposed to protect me are the very people who've hurt me, whilst telling me that they love me. It just does not make sense. So it's a moral injury that we're subjecting children and young people to. I've tried to map it to show, and I'm going to now do this so fast you're going to hate me, so I apologize, but these are available to you. Tried to map it to show the range of emotional responses, not just anxiety. Anyone tells you it's just anxiety, it's not true. There's depression, despair. We have children and young people who are suicidal. We have children and young people who are setting fire to themselves as a way of trying to communicate their distress. What they need is for us to understand. And not everybody feels it similarly. At the mild end, we are reassured by the idea that we can use carbon capture or technology or recycling. Our mild eco-anxiety responds to reassurance. But at the more severe end, and of course, luckily there is less people there, but this will increase, people get no respite, no safe space from this ever-present anxiety, because you can't escape what's happening out there in the world. I'm working with young people who, first thing they do is look outside every morning, and their emotional regulation is entirely dependent on what's the weather like. So this is just a few numbers. This is a 10,000 piece of research with 1,000 young people in these 10 different countries, published in 21, because we needed numbers. We got the clinical data, but what we also needed was numbers across this. And I just want to show you a couple of highlights. So 45% told us it was having an impact on daily living. That's eating, sleeping, concentrating, going to school, self-regulation. And if you look at the graphs, it's no great surprise, India, the Philippines, Nigeria are the worst affected. The UK, least affected in terms of daily living. But I want us to remember that, and I'm going to show you something else. Because our children, young people in Europe, North America, the UK, not protected. So it's low in terms of daily living impact. Emotionally, this is the global figure. Anxiety is not number one. Sadness is number one. Sadness at that sense of not being looked after. Anxiety is pretty high. So that's the emotional range. But now let's look at the cognitive impact, because for me this is the most important. It's the way young people think about their futures, think about themselves in relationship to their futures. And the UK figure goes back up to the worldwide average. 80% of young people in the UK think people have failed to take care of the planet. If young people think the future is frightening, it's 75% worldwide, but it's 73% UK. So although the young people in the UK are not facing waking up, surrounded by wildfires and floods, they've still got this cognitive impact. This is a ticking time bomb in terms of mental health difficulties. And that humanity is doomed. This is a cognitive framing, a way of thinking about themselves in the future. 56% worldwide average. Very high, of course, India, Philippines, 51% UK. So we've got a global responsibility. We should be ashamed of these figures in India, the Philippines, Nigeria, Brazil, Portugal. Colonialism sits underneath all of this. Exploitation, not taking care of the Earth's resources as well as the Earth's children, sits underneath all of this. And then, if we think that's bad, I'm sorry, I'm a terrible opening speaker. I'm going to depress everyone for you. I'll give you some good news before I stop. I'll try. If we think those were bad, look at this one. 48% told us they were dismissed or ignored when they tried to talk about climate change. There is nothing we should be dismissing children and young people around. They tried to talk to you about feeling sad about parents getting divorced or somebody dying. We wouldn't dismiss and ignore them, would we? But we're dismissing and ignoring them when they try to talk about this, because we don't know how to talk about it. And then we linked it to governments. We linked it to confidence in governments. And this was in 2021, very interesting if we were able to repeat this right now. And this is the UK. Only 28% thought government could be trusted. I think it'll be a bit lower now. So that's the relational fracturing. You're social workers, you will understand this. I'm talking to an audience today that I know will get this. So it's a human rights issue. But I did say I'd give you something nice at the end, and then I promise I'm shutting up, passing over to you. When we published this research, I got emails from young people all over the world, which is pretty unusual. And this was from a 14-year-old. She said, "What the study reveals makes me, for the first time ever, feel I'm not alone with the future and climate anxiety I experience every day. I don't know where to go to deal with this." I sent her lots of stuff. This recent study is an incredibly important step for us young people around the world to emotionally connect and visually realize no one of us is alone with this huge issue. I really hope this message of your study reaches politicians around the world, as well as socio-psychological professions, so they can react to the needs of us young people. So, I have to end with her. She's the best. What do you two think? Over to you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Caroline. That was incredibly moving and important. Yeah, I found that, when someone said, "I wish I was mad," I think this is key, isn't it? And it's, I guess, really important not to pathologize climate anxiety and to understand it as a really normal response from young people to a political system and to an economic system that is killing people and killing everything we love in the natural world. So I guess that's how I understand it.
That's put brilliantly. Thank you.
Yeah. None of it was surprising because I could see myself in it, and I think that's the kind of sad thing but great thing in the same way, because at least someone's talking about it. Because I remember when I first started feeling a lot of grief around what was happening in the climate, I was a teenager, and I was lucky enough to have the support of where my mum was willing to get a therapist because I was so depressed. I couldn't get out of bed. I was struggling really bad with anxiety and depression. And I went to a therapist that told me that I shouldn't think about it because if it's that bad, let's just not think about it. And I kind of, I remember kind of feeling really helpless at that point because it was like, how can I not think about what's happening in front of me? How can I not think about the harm that's being caused and the harm that at one day I will end up facing the consequences of? And I think that's the thing with young people.
Would it have worked?
What do you mean?
Would it have worked if you could just put it out of your head?
I don't think you can, though, because once you know, you can't kind of go into a space of ignorance. And I think that's how I also related with the woman who said she wished she was going mad. I wish I was ignorant, and I think that's the thing. Sometimes I do wish I just never knew, because my whole life has changed trajectory because I knew. Sometimes I wish, I'm 24 now, and I wish I had the holidays at 20 and going to Ibiza like every other 20-year-old. But in actuality, I was talking to politicians, trying to make them understand that young people are really hurting now and that we have to address this. And that is not the youth that I think I was promised when I was a young person. That is not the 20s that I thought I would have. And this profession is not the profession that I wanted either. But it's something that I feel like we've kind of all been kind of forced into in a way.
Sounds like your mum was important. Did she understand you?
My mum, she didn't quite understand me for a very long time, yeah. And I think, to be honest, that you talked about Nigeria. My family's from Nigeria. They're from the Niger Delta region, which is one of the oil regions. So exploitation around the environment was something that I grew up knowing about and saw the consequences of as well. But it was only when my auntie's house was flooded and she became homeless did my mum finally connect that this is not just a thing about the birds and the bees and the trees. This is a thing that's going to affect everyone and all life on Earth as well. And that's when she really started to understand and started to want to know more as well. And we've been on such a journey of her getting to why I suffer with such depression and grief, especially around the natural world. Yeah.
Who helped you? Thanks, Des.
I mean, you know, I remember leaving school as the IPCC report came out, and I don't think I'd emotionally connected with it at that point. It was like, this is kind of scary, right? But yeah, I wasn't feeling this grief that I feel every day now. You know, and I went to a few youth strike things, and again, you know, it was like kind of fun to have the day off school, this kind of thing. But again, I hadn't really emotionally connected. And then I spent a long time working in Calais at the border. And this is when it really hit me, you know. And I worked with some amazing people. I worked with a beautiful Kurdish-Iranian family. Their names were Shiva, Razul, Armin, Anita, and Armin was 18 months old, and they all drowned in the Channel. And yeah, I can never forgive those in power for killing that family and those children, and I'll never forgive them. But this is the reality of the times we live in. This is the reality of the climate crisis. It's billions of people being displaced, having to leave their homes, and drowning in the sea. It's children growing up in refugee camps. It's droughts that sweep through countries and people starve. It's floods that destroy a whole village. So, you know, this is the grief that me and many young people are living with every day. And yeah, I carry that grief around with me, the grief for people that have already died and the millions or billions of people that are going to die unless something drastic changes.
Yeah, and for me, it's like, the way that I see it is the climate crisis is one of relation. It is very much linked to exploitation of the natural world and of ourselves as well. But with the climate crisis, it's particularly unique because all the other social issues are exacerbated because of it. And I think that's the difficulty. So growing up, I actually experienced poverty in the UK. And I grew up in a one-bedroom flat with 6 people. And it was that financial difference of where I could feel that, you know, when my family became middle class, my life changed. And I know a lot of people from my childhood who their lives didn't change, and the way that the climate crisis is affecting them now is very different, because I had the privilege of going, okay, I'm going to decide to become a climate activist as a job. But in actuality, other of my friends who want to do this work, who want to feel like they can bring their grief into action and agency, they've got bills to pay, you know, and it's like all of these issues of whether it's racism or sexism or, you know, poverty, all of them are kind of stacking on top of each other and making the climate crisis feel so much heavier as well, because there's a real level of feeling like you're totally powerless in what you're already feeling, and then, you know, feeling totally powerless in the way of like where the world is going right now as well.
Your voices are so powerful. I don't want to patronize you. And it's really hard, I think, for us to fully understand. I do my best to understand. And then every time I hear young people speaking directly as brilliantly as you both are, it gets me again. And it makes me understand more. How can we help you get that message out to more people? We're going to hand over to Ruth in a minute, but what can we do? What should we do? Tell us what to do. We'll do it, won't we? We will, won't we? Yeah, we will.
Yeah, I kind of have a model of what I tell adults to do for young people. And I think the first is recognizing of agency, especially as a young person. You're kind of told that this isn't your problem to bear. Go and do other things. And that's just not true. You don't have the space and time to feel like you can do other things. So it's about how do we support young people in finding their agency within this issue. For me, going into activism was actually the one thing that kind of helped my depression, because it kind of felt like I was doing something about this issue that felt so big. And then also I think grief tending is a real large part of it, because that's, for me, the emotion that came up the most. It was how I was really grieving for not just the natural world and what's already happening, but also for the future and life that I thought I would have. I don't think about the future, because thinking about the future is very depressing, you know, and I kind of have to just think about what can I do right now to get by. And I think that's the way a lot of young people are feeling. So there's that, and then there's also like an education element as well, of how we educating ourselves into recognizing that the climate crisis isn't just about carbon emissions, it's so much more. It's about the way that we decide to live, the way that we decide to govern, and the way that we decide to care and have duty to ourselves and one another. And it's about how do we bring this not just to all the professions that we are, but also how do we act as active citizens in democracy to change the democratic system? Because without that, legislation won't be passed, without that, policy won't be passed. And that means that we can't help the next generation to not have to bear the brunt of what we're holding right now.
I agree.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
I mean, I work in kind of legal activism these days, and I find myself surrounded by incredibly brave and incredibly emotionally mature young people who are willing to risk everything for a chance at a livable future. You know, some of them risk arrest. And then these young people come up against the full force of the state. They come up against the criminal justice system. They come up against the tabloids, politicians that demonize them and delegitimize them. And they're abused online, abused on social media, and you know, essentially betrayed by all these institutions that are supposed to care for us, to provide justice for us, to tell us the truth. So I think what older generations can do for younger generations is to legitimize the actions of those who are resisting right now. That's so important. And to stand with us against a state that's betrayed us.
Yeah. I wish we had longer, but I suspect we're way over time, and I apologise terribly. We're going to pass over to Ruth.
Listening to you two, I'm not just a social worker, I'm also a mother, and a lot was coming up for me, and I just remembered a conversation I had with my daughter, who doesn't talk to me much about the climate situation, but she does sometimes bring things to me, and she asked me the other day what the world is going to look like after everything's gone. And I told her, sorry to get emotional, and I told her it's what it looks like is up to us now. What we do now makes a decision about what things look like in the future. And there's a team of us, the Climate Child Protection Safeguarding team, and we've been looking at that. This is a safeguarding issue. This is a child safeguarding issue. They're being neglected. Their needs are being neglected. And we need to step in, and social work has those tools, it has those skills, and when I start applying those and start looking at those, you can see what we can do, what parts of the social work profession is needed now, actually, more than anything. We know how to see children, we know how to listen to young people, and we know how to advocate for them and meet those needs, and we need to start doing that. We need to start applying what we've got. And so we've been, as a team, been asking, what would that look like? What can we bring? And we've got a workshop happening tomorrow morning that sort of will go through everything that we've brought together so far. There's also one of our team, Deborah, if you want to talk about this and look at this straight after the plenary, Deborah's running an online workshop with another young person looking at restorative youth work in climate breakdown as well. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so moving and real, and I think it's a great. You said you were a terrible first speaker. I think this is what we need to be sensitised to. This is some of what we need to be actually genuinely thinking about throughout these 2 days. Is these experiences for young people, for all of us, but the impact on young people whose trajectory feels so different perhaps to previous generations because of the climate crisis and other environmental crises, and also what we can do and supporting the activism. So can we please thank our first speaker.